The storm seemed endless, each raindrop hitting the ground with the weight of a hammer. The streets of the city were almost deserted, except for a few cars speeding past, throwing waves of water onto the sidewalks. The lights of the street lamps, yellow and weak, swayed under the impact of the wind, creating wavering shadows that moved like ghosts across the walls of the buildings. It was a night that any sensible person would have spent indoors. But Leonard Walters was no longer a sensible person. Wrapped in his heavy wool overcoat, he walked down the sidewalk like a man with nowhere to go, even though he owned more property than he could count. He carried no umbrella, and the rain had soaked him from head to toe. But that didn't matter either. Leonard felt that nothing else mattered. Ever since Lindsay, his wife, had died, he had lived like an automaton. He got up every day, went to work, had meetings, and returned to the empty mansion where her absence was almost palpable. The storm suited him. It was chaotic, relentless, cold. He thought of Lindsay, as he always did. 10 years had passed, but time didn't seem to have softened the pain. She was the only person who had managed to see beyond the facade he presented to the world. The brilliant businessman, the millionaire with charm and charisma. Lindsay knew that behind it, Leonard was just a broken man trying to hide his flaws. And now that she was gone, all that remained were the cracks. As she walked, something caught her eye. He was about to cross the street when he saw a figure crouched under the marquee of a closed restaurant. It was a young woman, huddled against the wall, trying to protect 2 children from the rain. She wore an old, torn coat, clearly too big for her small, frail body, and held a baby in her arms. Next to her, a little girl with disheveled hair was crouched down, her knees pulled up to her chest, shivering with cold. For a moment, Leonard was paralyzed. He had seen beggars before. New York was full of them. But there was something different about this woman. Perhaps it was the fact that she didn't seem to be asking for anything. There were no posters or pleas for help, just a desolate look as she struggled to keep the children dry. The scene hit him in a way he hadn't expected. A small voice inside him, which he usually ignored, urged him to do something. He crossed the street, his soaked shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. As he got closer, the woman sensed his approach and instinctively cringed, as if expecting to be reprimanded. "Are you all right?" asked Leonard, his voice harsher than he had intended. He wasn't used to interacting with strangers, let alone someone in a situation like this. The woman raised her eyes to him, and Leonard was taken aback by her gaze. There was a mixture of pride and desperation, an almost feral glint that said, "I don't want your pity, but I need help." It was a look he recognized in a way. He had felt this way before. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you, sir." His voice was hoarse, perhaps from cold or exhaustion. Leonard looked at the children. The little girl seemed to freeze where she stood, while the baby emitted little moans of discomfort, pressed against his mother's chest. It was a scene he knew he wouldn't be able to get out of his head if he just carried on. "It doesn't look good for me." He took his wallet out of his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, but when he looked at the children again, he thought it wasn't enough. He took out 4 more bills, totaling $500, and held them out to the woman. "Take these. There's a hotel on the next block. Use the money to spend the night in a dry place." The woman looked at the money as if it was something she didn't know how to hold. Her eyes widened, but she made no mention of taking the notes. "I don't want a handout, sir." The answer came quickly, almost defensively. "It's not a handout," said Leonard, feeling a slight twinge of irritation. "It's for them. You can't keep 2 children here in the rain. Are you going to take it or not?" She looked at her children, then at Leonard, and finally reached out a trembling hand to take the money. Her hands were red and wrinkled from the cold. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "This means more than you can imagine." "What's your name?" asked Leonard, as he picked up his cell phone to call the hotel and secure a room. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer. Katie. Leonard nodded, memorizing the name. He called the hotel and explained the situation. He assured them that they would have a room ready and asked that they be welcomed with discretion. When he had finished, he looked at Katie again. "It's done. They're waiting for you." She was silent for a moment, holding the money tightly. When she finally moved, she stood up slowly, settling the baby in her arms and helping the girl to her feet. Leonard watched as she left the marquee and walked towards the hotel he had mentioned. The rain continued to fall, but she seemed more upright, as if the weight on her shoulders had lessened a little. Leonard stood there for a few minutes, watching as her figure disappeared into the darkness. He should have felt satisfied, perhaps even proud, but all he felt was an inexplicable unease. Something about that woman had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought, and started walking again. After all, he had his own ritual to fulfill the next morning. As he made his way towards his mansion, the rain continued to fall, but this time Leonard noticed that something had changed. It was almost imperceptible, but he felt a small spark of warmth where the emptiness used to be. The next morning brought a lull in the storm, but the sky was still covered in dense, heavy grey clouds, as if they reflected Leonard's mood. He drove alone, the engine of his black sedan purring softly as the defoliated trees whizzed past the windows. On the way to the cemetery, he felt the familiar oppression in his chest. It was All Souls' Day, a day he had respected almost religiously since Lindsay had died. 10 years had not been enough to ease the pain or the sense of guilt he carried. The road leading to the cemetery was lined with ancient oak trees, whose dry branches formed arches over the road. Leonard parked in an inconspicuous corner of the empty parking lot and picked up the bouquet of white lilies from the passenger seat. They were Lindsay's favorite flowers, and he brought the same kind every year. It was a small gesture, almost pathetic compared to the emptiness her absence left, but it was all he could do. The cemetery was silent, except for the sound of the wind whistling through the trees and the rustle of dry leaves on the gravel paths. Leonard walked slowly, each step echoing in his ears. He knew the path to Lindsay's grave like he knew the lines of his own palm. He passed rows of old gravestones, some decorated with fresh flowers, others forgotten, covered in moss and neglect. Finally, he reached the place where she rested. The headstone was simple, made of white marble, with an inscription that he had personally chosen. Lindsay Walters, beloved wife, always in our hearts. Leonard knelt down, ignoring the pain in his knees as he touched the cold ground. He placed the bouquet of lilies at the base of the headstone and closed his eyes. There, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, if only for a few minutes. His trembling hands touched the cold stone as he murmured words that he repeated every year. "Hello, Lindsay." His voice came out hoarse, as if he were talking to a ghost. "Another year. I wanted to tell you that things are better, but they're not. Nothing is. I miss you every day. I miss the way you made everything seem lighter, as if any problem could be solved with a smile." He stopped, the lump in his throat growing. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I still wonder if I could have done more. If I'd realized it before, maybe you'd still be here." His voice faltered, and he closed his eyes tightly, trying to hold back the tears. The silence around him seemed almost oppressive, but it was broken by the sound of footsteps. Leonard opened his eyes and turned around, frowning. There was someone behind him, a female figure carrying something in her arms. When he focused his gaze, he felt his heart stop. It was the woman from the night before, the beggar. She was there, with the baby nestled in a blanket and the little girl holding her hand. Leonard stood up slowly, still processing what he was seeing. "You—" He couldn't complete the question. "What are you doing here?" The woman hesitated, looking at him with the same mixture of pride and vulnerability that he had seen the night before. Her eyes quickly shifted to the gravestone, and then back to Leonard. "Was she your wife?" she asked, her voice soft, almost reverent. Leonard was stunned. How did she know? He took a step towards her, the confusion evident on his face. "How do you know that?" Her voice was harsher than he had intended, but he couldn't help it. Her presence there, in such an intimate place, felt like an intrusion. Cady took a deep breath, pressing the baby against her chest as if seeking courage. "I knew her," she said at last, her voice trembling. "Lindsay, I knew she'd be here." Her words hung in the air like silent thunder. Leonard stood paralyzed, trying to process what she had said. How was that possible? Lindsay had never mentioned anything about knowing a young woman like Cady. "Did you know my wife?" he almost whispered, unable to believe it. Cady nodded, her eyes fixed on the gravestone. "She used to visit the orphanage where I grew up every month. She brought toys, books, things we could never have. I learned years later that she made generous donations to maintain the orphanage, too. She was the kindest person I've ever met." Leonard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Orphanage? Lindsay had never mentioned anything about visiting an orphanage. He took another step towards Cady, trying to understand. "When was this?" he asked, his voice full of urgency. Cady looked at him, her eyes watering. "For years, but she stopped going. 10 years ago." Leonard felt his stomach turn. 10 years, the same amount of time that Lindsay had been dead. He began to feel a growing nausea, as if the pieces of a painful puzzle were falling into place. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice tense. Cady hesitated before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was charged with emotion. "Because I knew, a long time ago, that she died. The director of the orphanage told me. I was just a teenager, but it destroyed me. She was the only person who really cared about me." Leonard blinked, feeling the weight of what she was saying. He looked at the young woman, and for the first time realized something he had ignored before. There was something about Cady's features that seemed familiar. He shook his head, as if trying to dispel an impossible thought. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Why didn't she ever tell me about you?" Cady bit her lip, clearly hesitating before saying, "Well, I think she was my mother." The statement dropped like a bombshell. Leonard remained motionless, the air trapped in his lungs. He looked at Cady, searching for some evidence that this was a mistake, but he couldn't find it. Cady took a deep breath, her voice breaking. "She never told me that, but the way she held me back. She was careful with all the children in the orphanage, but it was different with me. I don't have any proof, but I know it's true." Leonard took a step back, the impact of her words finally hitting him. He looked at Lindsay's gravestone, and then at Cady, feeling like his whole world was falling apart. Leonard drove home like a lost man, the thoughts swirling in his mind like a storm. Cady's words echoed incessantly. She was my mother. It was an idea as absurd as it was painful. He knew Lindsay had secrets, everyone does. But the idea that she could have a daughter and that she would have kept it from him was a blow he never imagined he would face. The road to the mansion seemed longer than ever. Leonard's large estate was in an upscale neighborhood, far from the chaos of the city center. Surrounded by tall trees and a wrought-iron gate, the mansion exuded wealth and power. But for Leonard, it was just a mausoleum for his memories of Lindsay. He parked the car in the garage, turned off the engine and stood there for a few minutes, taking a deep breath before finally getting out. Inside the house, the silence was oppressive. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hall, greeted him, but he just waved distractedly and went straight to the study. He knew what he was looking for, although he wished he hadn't found anything. In one of the desk drawers was a key he hadn't used for years. He took it and climbed the stairs to the office that used to be Lindsay's, a room he'd never had the courage to transform. The door creaked slightly as he opened it. The office was exactly as she had left it, except for the slight smell of dust that had accumulated over time. The desk was impeccably tidy. On the dresser, there was a photograph of them on their wedding day. Lindsay had been radiant that day, her smile lighting up the scene. Leonard looked away, unable to bear the pain that this image brought. He went straight to the closet. At the bottom, hidden behind a row of dresses she would never wear again, was a small wooden box that he recognized immediately. He knew that Lindsay kept personal things in there, but he had never had the courage to open it. Until now. With trembling hands, he picked up the box and carried it over to the bed. He sat down and turned the key in the lock. The click of the lock echoed in the silent room. He opened the lid slowly, as if he was afraid of what he would find. Inside the box was a collection of carefully stored objects, letters, photos, and a small leather-bound diary. Leonard picked up the diary, feeling his heart race. He opened to the first page, where Lindsay's handwriting delicately filled the paper. March 20th, 2000. I did something I never thought I could. I said goodbye to my daughter. Leonard froze. He read the words again, as if he expected the meaning to change, but there was no mistake. Lindsay had had a daughter. He turned the page, his fingers trembling. I was 17. My parents didn't give me a choice. They told me that a girl my age, pregnant and without a husband, would be a disgrace to the family. They took me away to a home for single mothers where I stayed until I gave birth. Then, when she was born, they took her away from me. I never held her in my arms. I never saw her, but I knew she was perfect. Leonard flipped through the pages quickly, his eyes devouring Lindsay's words. The diary told a story he had never imagined. Lindsay had been forced to give up her daughter for adoption, but she had never forgotten her. When she became an adult and independent, she started visiting the orphanage where her daughter had been placed. It was her way of making amends, of trying to be part of the life of the child she should never have lost. I called her Katie, even though that wasn't the name the adoption papers said. For me, she will always be Katie. She's so beautiful. She has my eyes. Every time I see her, I feel like my heart is going to break into 1,000 pieces, but I can't stop. I need to be there for her, even if she never knows who I am. Leonard closed the diary, the weight of the revelations crushing him. He stood up, pacing back and forth in the room. His mind was in chaos. How could Lindsay hide something so big from him? Why had she never trusted him to share this burden? But deep down, he knew the answer. He had always been a practical man, with rigid opinions about right and wrong. Lindsay must have feared that he wouldn't forgive her, that her secret could destroy their marriage. He felt a pang of guilt when he realized that she was probably right. Leonard picked up the photos in the box. Some showed Lindsay standing next to children in an orphanage with a bright smile that he recognized so well. In one of them, there was a little dark-haired girl holding a book in her small hands. He looked at the picture more closely and felt his heart squeeze. It was Katie. He didn't need any more proof. Lindsay had a daughter, and now that daughter was alive, lost and carrying her own children while trying to survive on the streets. Leonard descended the stairs with heavy steps, still holding the diary. Mrs. Hall, who was in the kitchen organizing something, saw him pass and stopped. "Mr. Walters, is everything all right?" she asked, concerned. Leonard just shook his head and headed for the study. He sat down in his leather chair and opened the diary again, this time to the last entry. October 15th, 2013. I was with Katie today. She doesn't know I'm her mother, but I feel like a part of me is dying every time I have to leave her behind. I want to tell her the truth so badly, but I can't. I'm afraid of what Leonard would say. I'm afraid of losing everything. Maybe I already have. Leonard closed his eyes, feeling the tears flow. He had never realized how much Lindsay carried alone. He thought he knew her, but now he saw that there was a whole part of her that he had never tried to uncover. Suddenly, a resolution began to form inside him. He had lost Lindsay, but he didn't have to lose Katie. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to right the wrongs that had been done. The clock at reception was almost 5 in the afternoon when Leonard entered the hotel lobby. The silence there was only broken by the soft tinkling of a small decorative fountain in the corner and the occasional clicking of the receptionist's computer keys. Leonard was nervous, which was rare for him. As he walked up to the counter, he could feel the weight of Lindsay's diary in his inside jacket pocket. He knew that this conversation with Katie would be painful, but he also knew that it had to happen. "Sir, can I help you?" asked the receptionist, looking him up and down. "Yes, I'm here to see a guest called Katie. She's staying with 2 children. I helped her register yesterday." The woman looked at the computer, typing rapidly. "She's in room 314. Would you like me to call her?" Leonard hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to invade her space, but he also couldn't risk her leaving without him having a chance to speak. "No, thanks. I'll go there myself," he replied, picking up the access card he had left with the receptionist the night before. When he reached the 3rd floor, Leonard took a deep breath before knocking on the door. He heard faint sounds on the other side, the muffled cry of a baby and a soft voice trying to soothe the child. Finally, the door opened, and Katie appeared, her face tired, but still with that same expression of determination he had noticed earlier. "Mr. Walters." She looked surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Can we talk?" Leonard asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He knew he had to be careful, but every second of waiting seemed to increase the tension in his chest. Katie looked into the room, as if checking on the children, and nodded. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The room was simple, but clean. The girl was sitting on the bed, drawing on a piece of paper, while the baby slept in a baby carriage next to her. Leonard stood for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He finally turned to Katie. "I've discovered something." "Something about Lindsay," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Katie crossed his arms, his face hardening slightly. "What do you mean?" Leonard took a deep breath, pulling the diary out of his jacket. He held out the small notebook to her, the worn leather gleaming in the light of the room. "She left this. It's her diary. It's all about you." Katie stood motionless, as if the diary was something dangerous. She looked at Leonard, then at the object in her hands, before finally picking it up. She sat down on the edge of the bed and began to leaf through the pages carefully. Her eyes widened as she read, and tears began to run down her cheeks. "So it's true," she murmured, almost to herself. "I've always known. I've always felt it, but..." Seeing it here, Leonard sat in a nearby chair, watching as Katie read. The silence was interrupted only by the soft sound of pages being turned. When she finally closed the diary, her shoulders were shaking and she clutched the small notebook to her chest. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" she asked, raising her eyes to Leonard. There was pain in her voice, but also anger. "Why didn't she ever get me out of that place? Why did she just leave?" Leonard felt the weight of the question as if it were directed at him. "I think she wanted to," he said, trying to organize his thoughts. "But she was afraid. Afraid of how the others would react, afraid that I wouldn't understand, that I wouldn't accept it." Katie let out a bitter laugh. "So she chose you over me. She chose to keep the secret, even if it meant leaving me in that place." Leonard shook his head, trying to dispel the resentment he saw growing in her. "It wasn't like that. She carried a lot of guilt for what happened to you. I never realized that before. I never knew how much she was suffering. And from what you said yourself, she was always there, looking after you, looking after the orphanage. Katie stood up, still holding the diary. She began to walk around the room as if trying to organize her thoughts. She was everything to me when I was a child, you know. Every month I waited for that day, the day she would show up at the orphanage with her smile and her presence. She was the only person who made me feel like I mattered. But then she just disappeared. Leonard watched as Katie stopped next to the baby carriage. She looked at the little sleeping face and ran her hand gently through the child's hair. I asked the director of the orphanage why Lindsay hadn't come. For months, I kept asking until she finally told me. She had died. Her voice trembled. I was 12 years old. At that age, I lost the only thing that still gave me hope. I cried for days, and then I stopped, because it didn't matter anymore. Leonard felt a knot tighten in his throat. He got up and walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone now," he said with more conviction than he felt. "I know that nothing can fix what happened, but I want to try. I want to be here for you, for your children. Not because I feel I owe you anything, but because Lindsay taught me the importance of taking care of the people who matter. And you matter." Katie turned to him, her eyes full of tears. "Why now? After everything I've been through, why do you think you can just show up and magically solve everything?" Leonard swallowed. He knew he didn't have a perfect answer. "I can't fix anything that happened before, but I can start now. I can try to be the father Lindsay would like me to be, and I can give you and your children the chance she never could. But Katie, I know it's hard to talk about, but I need to understand. After Lindsay stopped visiting you, what happened to you? Did someone adopt you? How did you end up on the streets?" Katie takes a deep breath, holding Leonard's gaze for a moment before looking down at the floor. "Like I said, I didn't know she was dead until months later. I didn't believe it at first. I asked the principal every day, begged for answers. And then she said..." Katie swallows, struggling not to get emotional. "She said that Lindsay had left, that she would never come back. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I felt so alone. The only person who cared about me was just dead." Leonard says promptly, his eyes full of sadness. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known, Katie..." She shakes her head, interrupting him. "There's nothing you could have done. After that, I stayed in the orphanage for a few years, but nobody adopted me. I was..." She laughs bitterly. "Too old. People want babies or small children. When I turned 16, they sent me away. 'You can manage on your own now,' they said." Leonard is perplexed. How can they just throw you out into the world like that, with nothing, without anyone? "That's how it works." Katie shrugs her shoulders, trying to appear indifferent, but her voice carries hurt. "I went to work in restaurants, stores, anywhere that would hire me. But what do you do when the world only gives you closed doors? I met the children's father when I was 18. He seemed nice at first, he seemed to care. But after Lily was born, everything changed. He started drinking, treating me like dirt. When I got pregnant with Henry, he said he didn't want another child. One day he just disappeared." Leonard asks, "What about you? What did you do?" Katie shrugs again, her gaze lost. "I did what I could. I worked as long as I could, carrying the weight of the pregnancy. But after Henry was born, everything fell apart. Nobody wants to hire a single mother with 2 small children. The bills started piling up. I was evicted. I tried to find shelters, but they're always full and..." Her voice falters, tears welling up. "I went so far as to beg for money on the street, something I swore I would never do. I felt so humiliated. Every person who passed by, pretending I didn't exist, was like a slap in the face." Leonard says, "I had no idea. When I saw you that night in the rain, I couldn't get you out of my head. Something about you seemed so familiar. Like Lindsay was pushing me towards you somehow. I'm so sorry for all of this, for everything you've been through. Katie stares at him, her eyes shining with emotion. There's no need to apologize. I don't want pity. I just want something that feels like hope. Something that makes it worth moving on. And that's what I want to give you, Katie. Lindsay can't be here, but I can. Let me help. Let me be part of this rebuilding. You don't have to carry all this alone, says Leonard. Katie hesitates, looking at Leonard with a mixture of incredulity and vulnerability. I don't know if I can trust so quickly. I've spent so much time alone, struggling to survive. It's hard to believe that someone wants to do something for me without wanting something in return, Leonard replies in a firm but gentle voice. I want nothing more than to see you and those children well. I can't erase the past, but I can help you build a future. That's what Lindsay would have done. It's what she would have wanted. Katie closes her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before nodding slightly. It's all right. I don't know where this is going, but I accept your help. For them, for what Lindsay meant to me. Leonard replies, relieved, and for you, because you deserve it. You're strong, Katie, more than anyone I've ever met. She finally allows a small tear to run down her cheek, a sign that her barriers are beginning to give way. Leonard feels that for the first time he has been able to truly reach her. The days that followed were unlike anything Leonard had experienced in the last 10 years. After his conversation with Katie, he insisted that she and the children move in with him. It wasn't an easy transition. She hesitated, refusing at first, but the emotional strain of the street and the weight of looking after 2 young children on her own eventually overcame her resistance. After all, even though she was wary, she knew that this might be her only chance to rebuild her life. When they arrived at Leonard's mansion, the children were stunned. The little girl, named Lily, gazed with fascination at the crystal chandelier that hung over the entrance hall. The baby, Henry, didn't seem to notice anything, but his little fingers clung tightly to his mother's arm, while she, with the same frightened expression, carried a bag that seemed to contain everything they owned in the world. Big, said Katie, breaking the silence, her gaze roaming the walls adorned with works of art. Leonard smiled almost apologetically. It can be a bit intimidating at first, but you'll get used to it. He gestured to the housekeeper who was coming to meet him. This is Mrs. Hall. She'll help you with everything you need. Mrs. Hall, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, gave a warm smile and bent down to speak to Lily. Do you like cookies, dear? She asked, in an affectionate tone. Lily nodded shyly, clinging to her mother's leg. Katie looked at Leonard, clearly uncomfortable. That's not necessary. Nays, she began, but Leonard held up a hand to interrupt her. Yes, it is. You're not alone now, Katie. Let us help. She hesitated for a few more moments before nodding, defeated. As the days went by, the dynamics of the mansion began to change. Mrs. Hall set up a room for Lily, decorated with soft colors and toys that Leonard had personally bought. For Henry, a crib was placed in a room next to Katie's, who now had an entire suite to herself. Kundi, however, seemed like a visitor in a place that didn't belong to her. She avoided direct contact with Leonard, keeping their interactions to a minimum. When she wasn't looking after Henry or playing with Lily, she sat in the garden, gazing at the horizon with a lost expression. Leonard watched everything from afar. He knew he couldn't force her trust, but he felt the urge to connect, to show that his intentions were genuine. One afternoon, he plucked up the courage and went to her in the garden carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. It's cold outside, he said, holding out one of the mugs. Katie looked up at him in surprise but accepted the tea. Thank you. There was an uncomfortable silence between them. Leonard looked at the trees in the distance, whose yellow autumn leaves were falling in the gentle breeze. You know, Lindsay loved this garden, he said at last. She said it was the only place in the house that seemed alive. Katie looked at him, clearly touched by the mention of the woman they both shared in their stories. She was incredible, she murmured, always so kind, so full of life. Leonard nodded, feeling the familiar pain return. She was. And I know I'll never be able to fill the void she left. But I want to do what she would have wanted. I want you to be well. Katie was silent for a moment before answering, her voice full of hesitation. I want to believe in you, Leonard. I want to believe that this can work. But it's still hard. I've spent so many years depending on myself that trusting anyone seems impossible. Leonard took a deep breath. He understood. He had also spent a decade building walls around himself. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm here, and I'm going to stay here, no matter how long it takes. Katie just nodded, holding the mug tightly. Little by little, things began to change. Lily, once shy and reserved, began to explore the house with enthusiasm. She ran around the corridors, laughing and joking with Mrs. Hall, who seemed to have developed a special affection for her. Henry, although still too small to understand what was going on, seemed calmer. Katie, meanwhile, began to come out of her cocoon more. Sometimes Leonard would find her reading in the garden, or helping Mrs. Hall in the kitchen. One night, while Cardi was putting Henry to bed, Leonard found her in the hallway. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She looked at him and for the first time seemed genuinely relaxed. "Yes, it is." She hesitated before continuing. "I wanted to thank you for all this, for giving us a place to stay. I know it's not easy for you either." Leonard gave her a soft smile. "No need to thank me. Your family. That's what matters." The words seemed to touch her, and for a moment the two shared a look of understanding. It was the start of something new, something they both desperately needed. As the weeks passed, Leonard began to feel different. He still visited Lindsay's grave regularly, but his visits began to change. Before, they were full of grief and guilt, but now he felt a kind of gratitude. He still missed her, but he knew that Lindsay had left him something precious, the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of Katie and the children. One Sunday morning, Leonard took Katie and the children to the cemetery. It was his suggestion, and Katie accepted, albeit reluctantly. They stood in silence for a long time in front of Lindsay's headstone. Leonard placed a bouquet of fresh flowers next to the headstone and looked at Katie. "She brought us together," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I didn't know that at the time, but now I understand. She always wanted the best for all of us, and that's what I want to do." Katie held Lily's hand, who was looking at the headstone with childlike curiosity. "Thank you for that," said Katie, her voice soft, "for not giving up on me, even when I didn't know how to accept your help." Leonard nodded, feeling something ease inside him. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time he felt hope. He had found a new purpose, a new reason to move forward. As they left the cemetery, Leonard looked at the children and then at Katie. He couldn't change the past, but he finally felt that he had the power to build a future for all of them. He would be the father and grandfather those three needed, and they would be the family he needed too. Life is made up of meetings and goodbyes, of losses that change us, and of second chances that we never imagined we would receive. Leonard lost Lindsay, the woman who was the light of his life, and for 10 years he lived in the shadow of her absence. But fate, in an unexpected way, brought him back to her, not through memories, but through a truth he had never known. Katie was the missing piece, a lost piece of Lindsay's past that now gave Leonard a reason to move on. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could embrace the present, welcome a new family, and finally find redemption amidst the pain. I appreciate you sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is made with dedication and affection, with a view to touching the hearts of those who hear it. If this narrative has awakened something in you, please consider signing up so that we can continue together on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is essential if we are to continue sharing these unique experiences. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next story.